If you ever want to know what someone truly means to you, get lost with them where nobody can tell you which way home is. That was the sentence my grandfather used to repeat every summer. And at the time, I thought it sounded like something printed on a coffee mug in a tourist gift shop. Turns out he was right. I just had to spend one unforgettable weekend in the middle of a national forest to understand it. My name is Connor Hayes, and for almost 12 years, my best friend Miles Bennett had been the one constant thing in my life. We met during freshman orientation at the University of Michigan after I accidentally sat in the wrong engineering seminar. He laughed, pointed me toward the correct classroom, and somehow convinced me to skip the rest of the afternoon for burgers instead. Looking back, that tiny mistake turned into the longest friendship either of us had ever managed to keep. Miles had become a wildlife photographer, the kind who disappeared into mountains for days just to capture a single sunrise that most people would scroll past in 2 seconds. I, on the other hand, became a structural engineer. I liked blueprints, predictable schedules, and coffee that came from the same diner every Monday morning. Miles collected passport stamps. I collected retirement account statements. Somehow it worked. Opposites make terrible roommates, but surprisingly reliable best friends. At least that was the joke everyone else liked to make. 3 weeks before everything changed, Miles called me while I was reviewing bridge inspection reports. "I need a favor," he said without bothering to say hello. "That already sounds expensive," I answered. "Just one weekend." Define just. 2 days. 1 backpack. A couple hiking trails. 0 cell service. I actually pulled the phone away from my ear to make sure I had heard him correctly. "You lost me at 0 cell service." He laughed, that easy laugh that somehow made every terrible idea sound reasonable. "Come on, Connor. You haven't taken a real vacation in almost a year." I went to Chicago for work. Exactly my point. I wanted to tell him no. I really did. My calendar was packed, my apartment needed repairs, and there were probably 50 better ways to spend a weekend than wandering through thousands of acres of forest carrying a backpack heavier than my first apartment refrigerator. But Miles had mastered the impossible art of making me agree to things before I realized I was agreeing. 2 Saturdays later, we were driving north before sunrise toward Pine Ridge National Forest with classic rock playing softly through the truck speakers and enough gas station snacks to survive what looked suspiciously like the apocalypse. Miles drove with one hand on the steering wheel while humming along to songs he never remembered the lyrics to. Every few miles he pointed at another ridge glowing beneath the morning light like he was introducing me to old friends. "You see that?" he asked for probably the 10th time. "Worth leaving your spreadsheets yet?" I looked out the passenger window at endless forests stretching across the horizon. "Ask me after I've had decent coffee. There's optimism. There's caffeine addiction." He grinned without taking his eyes off the road. Same thing. By 8:30 that morning, we reached the trailhead. A weathered wooden sign welcomed visitors before listing reminders about wildlife, changing weather, and staying on marked paths. Miles adjusted the camera hanging around his neck while I tightened the straps on my hiking pack for what felt like the 100th time. "Ready?" he asked. "No," I admitted honestly. "Perfect," he said. That's usually when the best stories begin. I rolled my eyes and followed him beneath the towering pines, completely unaware that before the sun went down, neither of us would have the slightest idea how to find our way back. The trail started exactly the way every travel brochure promised it would. Tall pines filtered the morning sunlight into long golden beams that stretched across the narrow dirt path. Birds called somewhere high above us, and the cool mountain air smelled like fresh earth after a light rain. Miles stopped every few minutes to photograph something I would have walked past without a second glance. A spiderweb sparkling with dew. Tiny mushrooms growing from an old fallen log. A hawk circling silently. Over the valley. I stood there holding 2 water bottles and wondering how someone could spend 5 full minutes taking pictures of moss. "You know," I said as he crouched beside another patch of wildflowers, "most people just use their phones." Without looking up, he smiled. "Most people miss everything." That sounds like something you practice saying in front of a mirror. No, it just sounds better than admitting I am obsessed. I laughed despite myself. That was the thing about Miles. He had this annoying ability to slow the world down until you started noticing details you normally ignored. By late morning, The main trail climbed steadily toward a rocky overlook where the trees opened to reveal miles of rolling forest stretching across the horizon. Even I had to admit the view was worth the hike. We sat on a weathered boulder sharing sandwiches while a cool breeze carried the scent of pine across the ridge. Miles leaned back on his elbows, staring toward the distant mountains. "You ever think about disappearing for a while?" he asked. "You mean like turning off my phone?" "No, really disappearing. No meetings. No deadlines. No expectations." I took another bite before answering. "I worked too hard building my life to disappear from it." He nodded slowly, although his expression suggested he understood my answer without agreeing with it. We packed up after lunch and continued toward a connecting trail that Miles insisted would lead us to an old fire lookout before sunset. According to the map, it was only another 3 miles. According to my legs, it was somewhere around 30. About an hour later, the sky began changing. Thin gray clouds drifted over the sun, replacing the warm light with a colder shade that seemed to flatten everything around us. The wind picked up almost without warning, rustling the branches overhead until the entire forest whispered at once. Miles stopped walking. "That is earlier than I expected." "What is?" I asked. He pointed toward the clouds gathering over the western ridge. "Weather." I looked up. "Looks like rain." "Maybe." We picked up our pace. The trail narrowed as thicker undergrowth closed in around us. Fallen branches crossed the path often enough that we had to climb over them one by one. Eventually, we reached a large pine that had crashed directly across the trail, its massive trunk blocking the marked route completely. Fresh splinters showed where the tree had recently fallen. "Well," I sighed, "that seems inconvenient." Miles unfolded the paper map and studied it carefully. There should be a maintenance path around this somewhere. We searched for nearly 10 minutes before finding what looked like a narrow side trail weaving between dense trees. It was barely visible beneath leaves and pine needles. "You are sure this is it?" I asked. "Pretty sure." "Pretty sure is not the phrase I want to hear in a forest." He folded the map with a confident grin that somehow made me even less confident. "Trust me." I followed anyway because I always had. At first the path looked promising, but after another 20 minutes the ground became uneven and the trail slowly faded until it blended into the surrounding woods. I reached into my pocket for my phone out of habit. No signal. Miles checked his handheld GPS unit. The screen blinked twice before displaying a message neither of us wanted to see. "Signal lost." We stood there listening to the wind moving through the trees. Every direction suddenly looked exactly the same. For a few long seconds neither of us spoke. It was strange how quickly confidence disappeared when every tree looked identical. The forest had not changed, but somehow it no longer felt welcoming. It felt patient, as if it had all the time in the world while we suddenly realized we did not. I forced a laugh that sounded much weaker than I intended. "Tell me this is the part where the experienced wildlife photographer says everything is completely under control." Miles looked around slowly before answering. "I can honestly say that everything is manageable." "That is not what I asked." "I know." He slipped the GPS back into his backpack and unfolded the paper map again, turning it in different directions. "We still know roughly where we are." "Roughly?" "Connor." "Miles." He sighed through his nose before smiling anyway. "You are making that engineer face again." "I have an engineer face?" "The one where you look like you are calculating how much confidence you have left in me." "The answer is dropping by the minute." That earned me a quiet laugh, and somehow hearing it made my own heartbeat slow down a little. If Miles was still joking, maybe things were not as bad as they felt. We decided to stay calm and retrace our steps. That sounded simple enough until we turned around and discovered there were at least 4 narrow openings between the trees that all looked exactly like the one we had just walked through. Leaves covered the ground without a single clear footprint remaining. The wind had erased every clue. "Did we come from there?" I asked, pointing toward one opening. Miles frowned. "I thought so." The hesitation in his voice caught me off guard. Miles never hesitated outdoors. He was usually the person everyone else followed. Watching him second-guess himself made the silence around us feel heavier. We picked one direction and walked for almost 30 minutes, hoping to reconnect with the marked trail. Instead, we reached a shallow creek neither of us remembered crossing. The clouds above continued thickening until the sunlight faded into a dull gray glow. A cool breeze turned noticeably colder. Then the first raindrop landed on my sleeve. Another tapped against my backpack. Within minutes, a steady rain settled over the forest, soft enough to avoid panic, but persistent enough to soak everything if we stayed exposed. Miles immediately pulled a lightweight tarp from his pack. "We need shelter before everything gets wet. Please tell me this was part of your brilliant vacation plan." "Not exactly." We searched along the hillside until we found two large boulders leaning toward each other, creating a narrow space protected from most of the rain. It was not comfortable, but it was dry enough. Together we stretched the tarp between nearby trees and secured it with rope while the rain drummed softly overhead. By the time we finished, my jacket sleeves were damp and my boots were covered with mud. I sat on a fallen log and let out a long breath. "I cannot believe this is happening." Miles handed me a bottle of water. Before sitting beside me, "You are allowed to be mad." "I am not mad." He raised one eyebrow. "I am disappointed." "That is somehow worse." I stared at the rain sliding off the edge of the tarp. "I trusted you." The words escaped before I could soften them. Miles looked down at his hands without answering. For the first time since I had known him, he seemed unsure of what to say. The silence stretched between us, filled only by falling rain and distant thunder somewhere beyond the hills. I immediately wished I could take the sentence back, but pride kept me quiet. Neither of us realized that the storm outside was only the beginning. The harder part was going to be surviving everything neither of us had ever found the courage to say aloud. The rain finally eased sometime near dusk, leaving behind a quiet so complete it almost felt unreal. Water dripped steadily from pine branches, each drop landing with a tiny splash that echoed through the stillness. The forest smelled richer now, like damp earth and fresh cedar, but the fading daylight reminded us that beautiful did not always mean safe. Miles stood and stretched before checking his watch. "We have maybe 30 minutes before it gets dark." "Enough time to find the trail?" I asked. He looked toward the endless trees surrounding us, then back at me. "Enough time to find a better place to spend the night." Neither of us argued. We packed our gear and moved carefully through the woods, following slightly higher ground in hopes of avoiding flooded areas. The conversation stayed light, almost deliberately so, as if we were both pretending the tension from earlier had washed away with the rain. Miles pointed out animal tracks pressed into the soft mud, while I pretended to be fascinated instead of wondering how many more hours it would take before someone realized we had not returned. After another 20 minutes, we found a small clearing bordered by massive pine trees that blocked most of the wind. It was not ideal, but it was better than the rocky shelter. Together, we gathered fallen branches for a small campfire using the emergency fire starter from Miles's backpack. Soon a gentle flame flickered between us, throwing warm light across the damp clearing while the sky slowly darkened overhead. I wrapped my hands around a metal camping mug filled with hot instant soup that somehow tasted far better than it deserved. "I owe you an apology," I said quietly. Miles looked up from adjusting one of the logs. "For what?" "Earlier." He shrugged. "You were frustrated. I said I trusted you like it was a mistake." He stared into the fire for a long moment before answering. "I keep thinking about that tree across the trail. If I had turned us around sooner." "Stop." He blinked. "You cannot blame yourself for every fallen tree in a national forest." A small smile finally appeared. "That sounds like something your therapist would say." I pay good money for those lines. The tension between us eased a little. The familiar rhythm returned, quiet jokes filling the spaces where worry wanted to settle. As the temperature continued dropping, I reached into my backpack looking for an extra pair of dry socks. Instead, my hand brushed against something woven from faded blue and gray cord. Confused, I pulled it free. It was a friendship bracelet. Mine. I recognized the uneven knot immediately because I had tied it badly during our senior year of high school at a charity camping event. I had assumed it disappeared years ago. "Why do you have this?" I asked. Miles froze for just a fraction of a second before looking over. Oh. He rubbed the back of his neck. "I found it after you thought you lost it." "That was almost 10 years ago." "I know." I turned the bracelet over in my hand. The colors had faded, but the tiny metal bead in the center was still there. "You kept it all this time?" He gave a quiet laugh that sounded more nervous than amused. "I guess I did." "Why?" He looked away toward the dark trees surrounding the clearing. "Some things are harder to throw away than people expect." The answer lingered between us. It was simple, too simple. There was something hidden underneath it that I could not quite reach. I watched the firelight dance across his face. noticing details I had somehow overlooked for years. The tired smile, the thoughtful silence, the way he always looked, calmer when he was surrounded by nature than anywhere else in the world. For the first time since we met, I found myself wondering if I actually knew everything about my best friend, or if the person sitting across the fire had been carrying a story he had never found the words to tell. Morning arrived quietly. Pale sunlight filtered through the branches, turning every raindrop into a tiny piece of glass. For a brief moment, it almost looked as though the forest had decided to apologize for the previous day. Birds returned with cautious songs, and a thin layer of mist drifted between the trees. I stepped away from the campsite to stretch while Miles folded the tarp with the kind of practiced efficiency that came from spending half his life outdoors. "You sleep at all?" he asked. "Enough to convince my back it deserves an apology." He laughed. "I will add a better sleeping pad to the packing list next time." "Bold of you to assume there will be a next time." He tossed me a granola bar. "Give it a week." I caught it without thinking. He was probably right. Somehow he usually was. After a quick breakfast, we agreed to follow the downhill slope, hoping it would eventually lead to a creek large enough to connect with one of the marked trails shown on the map. It was the best plan either of us had. The forest looked different in daylight. Details hidden by darkness suddenly appeared everywhere. Moss-covered fallen logs like soft green blankets. Ferns reached across the path. Sunlight broke through gaps in the canopy in bright columns that shifted every time the wind moved the branches. If someone had dropped me there without yesterday's memories, I would have called it peaceful. We hiked for nearly an hour before the terrain became noticeably steeper. Loose rocks poked through the damp soil, and the narrow path curved along the side of a rocky hillside. Miles walked a few steps ahead, scanning the ground while occasionally checking the map. "Careful," he called over his shoulder. "Everything is still slick. You are only saying that because you know I already slipped twice." "3 times. I was hoping you missed one." He smiled without turning around. "Not a chance." A few minutes later we heard it. Running water. Faint at first, then gradually louder. "Do you hear that?" I asked. Miles stopped immediately, listening. His face brightened for the first time since we had lost the trail. A creek. Hope returned so suddenly, it almost felt dangerous. We carefully followed the sound through clusters of pine until the hillside narrowed beside a shallow rocky stream flowing between smooth stones. "This is good," Miles said. "Creeks usually lead somewhere." He stepped onto a flat rock near the edge to study the direction of the current. I followed more cautiously, testing each step before shifting my weight. Then one damp stone rolled slightly beneath my boot. My foot slid forward before I could react. The world tilted. Instinct reached for balance that was no longer there. "Connor." Miles moved before I even understood what was happening. His hand caught my forearm with surprising strength just as I stumbled toward the lower slope beside the creek. My other knee hit the ground, sending cold water splashing across my jeans, but I stopped moving. Completely stopped. For several long seconds, neither of us spoke. He was still gripping my arm tightly enough that I could feel his hand trembling. I looked up. His face had gone pale. His breathing was uneven, as though he had just finished running uphill. "I have got you," he said quietly. "I know." He did not let go. Instead, he pulled me steadily back onto solid ground before taking 2 steps away and bending forward with both hands resting on his knees. He closed his eyes for a moment. "Miles." He shook his head without looking at me. "Do not ever scare me like that again." There was no humor in his voice. No teasing. Just raw relief that caught me completely off guard. When he finally looked back at me, I noticed something I had never seen in 12 years of friendship. His eyes were shining with tears he was trying very hard not to let fall. We stayed beside the creek longer than either of us admitted we needed to. Miles finally sat on a flat rock near the water, elbows resting on his knees, staring at the current as if it might hand him the right words. I lowered myself onto another rock a few feet away, giving him space without really thinking about it. The silence between us no longer felt awkward. It felt fragile, like one careless sentence could break something that had taken years to build. The water slipped over smooth stones with a steady rhythm, filling the empty spaces where conversation normally lived. "You almost scared 10 years off my life," Miles said at last. I tried to smile. I slipped. I did not fall off a cliff. "It does not matter." His answer came so quickly that it surprised both of us. He rubbed his hands together before letting out a slow breath. It matters because it was you. I looked at him carefully. There was no joke waiting at the end of the sentence. No sarcastic grin. Just honesty sitting there between us like something that had grown too heavy to carry alone. Miles, I said quietly, what is going on? He laughed once, but it was the kind of laugh people make when they are buying themselves a few extra seconds before saying something difficult. Do you remember sophomore year? The camping trip with everyone from college. The one where Trevor burned hot dogs so badly, we ordered pizza instead? That one. I nodded. You thought you lost that bracelet. He glanced toward me. I did not keep it because it looked nice. My heart gave a strange little pull that I could not explain. He continued before I could interrupt. Connor, I have spent years telling myself that eventually I would stop feeling this way. I thought if enough time passed, if you dated someone, if I traveled enough, if I stayed busy enough, it would disappear. He shook his head slowly. It never did. The creek continued flowing as though the world had not just shifted beneath my feet. I stared at him without knowing what expression was on my own face. Miles kept his eyes fixed on the water. Yesterday, when you said you trusted me, I realized losing our way out here scared me a lot less than the idea of losing you. He swallowed hard before finally looking at me. That is the truth I have been carrying around for years. I opened my mouth, but no words came out. 12 years of memories rushed through my mind all at once. Every birthday he never missed. Every apartment he helped me move into. Every phone call he answered, no matter how late it was. Every vacation he somehow convinced me to take. I had always assumed that was simply who Miles was. Loyal, kind, constant. Now I wondered how many moments I had misunderstood. I am not telling you because I expect anything, he said gently. Honestly, I almost took this with me to the grave. But after yesterday, after watching you slip, his voice grew quieter. Life feels too short to leave important things unsaid. He smiled, small and uncertain. If you never look at me the same way again, I will survive. If you need time, I understand. I just could not keep pretending that you were only my best friend when my heart has refused to believe that for a very long time. I looked down at the faded bracelet still wrapped around my wrist, then back at the man who had just entrusted me with the biggest secret of his life. For the first time since we had wandered off the trail, I realized we were no longer lost because of the forest. We were standing at the edge of a completely different path, and neither of us knew where the next step would lead. I did not answer him, not because I wanted to avoid the conversation, but because every response that entered my mind felt too small for what he had just trusted me with. Miles nodded once as though he had expected my silence all along. He stood slowly, adjusted the strap of his backpack, and offered me the same calm smile he had given me 1,000 times before difficult moments. We should keep moving, he said softly. The creek is still our best chance of finding a ranger trail. I simply nodded and followed him. We walked beside the flowing water for what felt like hours. The forest had become strangely different, even though nothing around us had changed. The trees were still tall. The creek still curved through polished stones. Sunlight still slipped through the branches in bright patches across the ground. The only thing that had changed was me. Every few minutes I caught myself looking at Miles when he was not paying attention. He always walked a little ahead whenever the ground became uneven. Every time we reached a fallen log, he crossed first before quietly turning around to make sure I made it over safely. When branches hung too low across the trail, he pushed them aside until I passed before letting them swing back into place. He had done these things for years. Somehow I had never really noticed them before. Or maybe I had noticed and simply called them friendship because it was the easier explanation. Around noon, we stopped near a large fallen cedar to rest. Miles handed me the last apple from our food bag without saying a word. What about you? I asked. I am fine. I split it in half and held one piece toward him. You always do that. He looked confused. Do what? Give me the better portion. He laughed quietly. Engineers notice strange things. Apparently not strange enough. The sentence escaped before I could stop it. He looked at me, searching my face, but I quickly looked away toward the creek. Neither of us pushed the conversation further. We started walking again. The silence between us no longer felt uncomfortable. It felt thoughtful. Every now and then our shoulders brushed while squeezing between narrow trees. And instead of stepping away immediately like we always had, neither of us seemed to rush to create distance. It was subtle, almost invisible, yet somehow everything felt different. Later that afternoon, we found ourselves climbing another gentle hillside. I slowed slightly, still thinking about everything Miles had confessed. Suddenly, a memory surfaced from years ago. The winter my father was hospitalized, Miles had driven nearly 4 hours after finishing an assignment just to sit beside me in a waiting room without asking a single question. The time my apartment flooded, he spent an entire weekend helping me move furniture even though he had a photography exhibition the following Monday. Every birthday card he ever gave me somehow mentioned how grateful he was that we had met. I had always believed I was simply lucky to have such a loyal friend. Now those memories carried an entirely different meaning. I stopped walking. Miles turned after noticing I was no longer beside him. "Everything okay?" he asked. I looked at him standing there beneath the tall pines with sunlight catching the edges of his brown hair. He looked exactly like the friend I had known for 12 years. Yet somehow I was seeing him for the first time. "Miles," I said quietly. "How long?" He understood immediately. His smile was gentle, almost embarrassed. "Long enough that I stopped counting." I felt my heart tighten, not from fear, but from the realization that while I had been carefully planning every bridge I would ever build, someone had been patiently building one toward me all along. The answer stayed with me long after we started walking again. Long enough that I stopped hearing the steady rush of the creek and started hearing every conversation we had shared over the past 12 years. It was remarkable how memory could rearrange itself in a single afternoon. Moments that had always seemed ordinary suddenly carried quiet meaning. The time Miles drove across the state because I mentioned over the phone that I had caught the flu. The countless weekends he suggested hiking, camping, or road trips that somehow always ended with just the two of us. The camera full of landscapes I admired without ever asking who had been standing behind it while those pictures were taken. Maybe I had spent years looking at his photographs without realizing I had also been standing inside his favorite story. We continued following the creek until the sound of moving water grew stronger. The narrow stream widened into a faster current that wound through a rocky valley. Miles studied the terrain before pointing toward a shallow bend where the opposite bank looked easier to cross. "If we get across there, we should be able to stay on higher ground," he said. The map showed an old ranger road somewhere east of the water. I nodded, trusting him without needing to think about it this time. We crossed carefully, stepping from one broad stone to another. When I reached the middle, I paused and looked back. Miles was watching me instead of his own footing. "You know," I said with a small smile, "you were supposed to watch where you were stepping." He smiled back. "Old habit." Once we reached the opposite side, the forest gradually began to change. The trees were spaced farther apart, and every so often we found small signs that people had once been there. An old wooden fence post almost hidden beneath vines. Rusted wire disappearing into the undergrowth. The weathered remains of what looked like a trail marker lying beside a stump. Hope returned carefully, like sunlight breaking through heavy clouds. We walked another 40 minutes before a distant mechanical sound drifted through the trees. At first I thought I imagined it. Then it came again, faint but unmistakable. An engine. Miles stopped so quickly that I nearly bumped into him. "Did you hear that?" he asked. "Please tell me I am not hallucinating." We stood perfectly still. The sound grew louder, then faded again before returning with a low rumble. "That is a vehicle," I said. Without another word, we picked up our pace, weaving between the pines toward the noise. The ground leveled out, and suddenly the trees opened onto a narrow gravel service road. I stared at it for a second before laughing out loud. It was not a highway. It was not even paved. It was the most beautiful road I had ever seen. Miles laughed too, the kind of relieved laugh that seemed to release 2 days of worry all at once. A park maintenance truck appeared around the bend a minute later. The driver slowed immediately after spotting us and rolled down the window. "You boys all right?" he called. Miles answered before I could. "We got turned around on the back trails yesterday." The ranger climbed out with a calm smile that suggested we were far from the first hikers to make that mistake. After confirming our names and radioing the visitor center, he offered us a ride back to the trailhead. As we climbed into the truck, I looked at Miles sitting beside me. Neither of us said anything. We did not need to. Somewhere between the silence, the creek, and the winding forest, the distance that had quietly existed between us for years no longer felt quite so impossible. 3 weeks passed before life finally began to feel familiar again. Familiar, but not the same. My office was still filled with blueprints, project meetings, and coffee that somehow tasted exactly the way it always had. Yet every ordinary moment carried a quiet reminder of the forest. Sometimes it was the faded friendship bracelet resting beside my keyboard. Sometimes it was the photograph Miles sent me of a sunrise over the mountains with no caption because he knew I would understand. We never rushed the conversation we had started beside that creek. Neither of us pretended it had not happened, but neither of us forced it to become something it was not ready to be. Instead, we did what we had always done. We spent time together. We talked. We laughed. The difference was that I finally allowed myself to notice the things I had overlooked for years. The way his eyes always searched for me first whenever we entered a crowded room. The way he remembered details I had forgotten telling him. The quiet patience that had never once asked me to become someone different than I already was. One Friday evening, Miles invited me to the opening of his newest photography exhibition at a small downtown gallery. White walls displayed enormous landscapes from national parks across the country. Visitors moved slowly from one photograph to another, speaking in soft voices while glasses clinked somewhere near the entrance. I wandered through the gallery until I reached the final photograph hanging by itself at the far end of the room. It was not a mountain. It was not a river or a sunrise. It was me. I was sitting beside a campfire wrapped in a borrowed blanket, looking toward the trees with a tired smile I did not even remember wearing. The firelight softened everything around me while the dark forest faded into the background. Beneath the frame sat a small title card. Home. I stood there for a long time without moving. I wondered how long it would take you to find that one, Miles said quietly as he stepped beside me. You took this? I asked, even though I already knew the answer. He nodded. The night before everything changed. I looked back at the photograph. Why call it home? He smiled, looking at the image instead of me. Because every place has always felt more like home when you were there. The words settled gently between us. This time they did. Not frighten me. They simply felt true. I turned toward him, suddenly understanding something that had been growing inside me ever since we left the forest. Do you know what I kept thinking about after we got back? I asked. He shook his head. I realized I never once wanted to walk away from you. Not after the confession. Not after the awkward silence. Not after everything changed. He listened without interrupting. I thought I needed time because I was confused. I continued. But maybe I needed time because I was finally seeing what had been right in front of me all these years. His expression softened in a way I had never seen before. Hope looked surprisingly quiet. I reached for his hand, giving him every chance to step back if he wanted to. He did not. His fingers closed around mine with the same calm certainty that had pulled me back to solid ground beside the creek. I do not want to go back to pretending nothing happened, I said. Neither do I, he answered. We left the gallery later that evening and stepped into the cool night air. The city lights reflected across rain-soaked sidewalks, reminding me strangely of sunlight shining through wet pines. I laughed to myself, realizing my grandfather had been right after all. Sometimes finding the right road has nothing to do with a map. Sometimes you have to lose the path you planned before you can recognize the person who has quietly been walking beside you the entire way.